It's Monday. We are here with Cha-ching, Gary Sasse, the money man. You've been off gallivanting around a little bit, taking advantage of all these Monday holidays and no broadcast. And what do you do? Just sit around counting your bitcoins and things like that?
No, I just make sure my mutual funds are doing okay.
It is a big week to talk about financial issues in the state of Rhode Island. The governor came out with her budget. It is it's got some twists and turns that I think people did not anticipate, although give the news team here at GoLocal a little credit. First to report about the issue of sports gambling coming out of the New Jersey lawsuit. I think we had that story about 3 weeks ago, and an interesting proposal with a lot of questions, and we've got a little more information I'll share with you. But what was your take on the budget overall?
Well, you know, John Carroll in Alice in Wonderland had the Cheshire Cat say this. I'm going to quote the Cheshire Cat. Imagination is the only weapon in the war against reality. I think that pretty well summarizes it.
So that was a strong endorsement on the fiscal tightness of Governor Raimondo's budget. Let's go through some of the issues. I'm going to go broad-based first and foremost. Is this just a typical governor running for re-election budget? In other words, I'm going to throw out some things and then kick it over to the House Finance and let them do all the work?
I think there's an element in the budget, and it's not just in the proposals, but it's the way the budget's funded.
Yeah.
So the governor talks about no tax increases, but there are plenty of tax increases in this budget. There's cigarette tax increase.
Right.
You know, more importantly, the sales tax is now extended to security services.
Right.
It's extended to software for service. So Microsoft 365, you know, could go to meeting. All these things are taxed.
Yeah, the cloud technology is taxed, and when reporters asked during the budget briefing, what does that mean? Literally no one in the budget briefing could even vaguely give any insights as to what that meant.
Well, it means that a very new form of commerce and communicating, we've decided to tax it. Other states tax it as well, but if you're looking for competitive advantages, you've just given up competitive advantage.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, yeah, so that in there, and then there's all kind of financial gimmicks in this budget. Sports betting, I think the governor's probably right. I think the Supreme Court will hold it as being legal, but this is the first time I can ever remember somebody including $23 million or even $1 in a budget with no legal authority to collect the money. And so that's more than a holding place. The scooping of places like Rhode Island Housing, the Student Loan Authority, Rhode Island Resource Recovery, you know, the list goes on. Transferring, a few years ago, we increased D&B fees significantly.
Yeah. And
that was supposed to go into a transportation improvement fund. No, it's now in this election year, it's going back into the
general fund.
In the general fund. So, you know, that, the gimmickry, you're talking about no broad-based tax increases when there are tax increases. The expansion of the marijuana dispensaries, expanding the definition to acute care. If you go, I have one question, I don't answer it because I can't answer it. If you go from 3 to 15 dispensaries, who are the people with the 12? You know, you talk about Money Man. The Money Man has no part of that action. I'd like to know who does. So those are all indications of an election year budget. And then when you get into some of the statements made on a program side, you also have the same reaction. Medicaid.
Yeah.
Everybody recognizes that we have extremely liberal Medicaid programs. Almost a third of the state are Medicaid recipients. We spend about $2 billion of our budget on Medicaid, that's federal and state. And so the governor rightfully says, I'm going to cut it by $165 million. But she doesn't cut it by $165 million. She reduces the pay to providers. That's not sustainable.
Right.
I think you have to talk about making the program more efficient, block granting the program, having more flexibility, using our great clout in Washington to try to get some treatment so we can use the money more effectively. Going back and looking at some of the things we do support with Medicaid, some of the things we can't. Kentucky just put a provision in their Medicaid program, which you can do now, a work requirement. And so, with the exception of the co-pays, which are very modest co-pays in the Medicaid program, most of the cuts are not cutting Medicaid, they're cutting the amount of money we pay to people who provide services to Medicaid recipients. And you can do some of that, some of them may have been overpaid. I think the guaranteed profit for managed care companies, Neighborhood Health, United Community Programs, et cetera, maybe we shouldn't guarantee them a 1.5% return, but we make out pretty well for managed care programs. I don't know what the kind of cost-benefit analysis was done there. So you have that. That's an election year budget saying I'm cutting Medicaid when you cut providers. Rhode Island Hospital is going to be up in arms. My calculation is that Rhode Island Hospital is losing somewhere between $5 and $7 million from these changes. Well, if you can't go out at day one and say technology, innovation, healthcare industry is a primary target to grow this economy, and you look at some of the investments that have been made by Commerce Rhode Island, and then cut the soul out of them.
So, well, if Lifespan's going to lose 5 to 7, Care New England's going to probably lose 3 to 5, and if they're losing 3 to 5, there's not 3 to 5.
Yeah.
They've already lost $120 million in the last 24 months.
And doing what the payment limits, which give them a little flexibility, put some more money, Medicaid money in. So the language is I find interesting. We're cutting 165 from Medicaid. No, you're not. You're cutting 165. You pay people to service Medicaid recipients. Some of that may be justified. A lot of it's going to put these agencies in harm's way. That's political. Education, I get a great kick out of the education budget. This is the education governor. Well, there were programs that were expanded. You know, they expanded the pre-K program, computer science education program, another $260,000, another $1 million each for each of the universities and colleges. But if you take all those innovative programs, that's less than $5 million.
Yeah.
When you look at state aid is probably growing by about 13 to 15 million. The general aid program is probably grown by half of that, 7 or 8 million, and yet the communities that get that money are going to get a bill because they have to kick in more to the retirement system. So, you know, where is the additional money for education? We have some very interesting programs, but they're small programs, but the big dollars that affect the property tax bill that you pay to support schools are not treated particularly well in this budget.
She came up with a plan for $1 billion. It kind of reminded me a little of Austin Powers, $1 billion for school rehabs. The plan, the analysis that came out in September by, I think, a pretty smart group that analyzed what the need is, came up with a need at about $3 billion and counting. I think you could probably spend $2 billion in Providence alone. I think those numbers are a little low. They've got a replacement cost at Classical High School of $76 million. That seems low based on what we saw nearly 10 years ago of rebuilding the middle school in Woonsocket, which I think went over $110 million when all said and done. So we've got all this pent-up demand. It's not all her fault, but when you really break down the numbers, it really only looks like it's about $250 million in new spending, and that's all a general obligation bond. So cost of borrowing taken into account. Was this a little bit of a sleight of hand by the governor of saying $1 billion when it's $250 of GL funding?
Well, I would never characterize anything the governor did as a sleight of hand, but it certainly may have exaggerated.
That might be the nicest thing you've ever said
No,
about
I said a lot of nice things. I think there's some good things being done, but I think to sell it as a $1 billion program, when you break down the numbers, and you just give me a minute to break down the numbers, there's $250 million that may or may not be put on the ballot for the people to approve. That's fine. There's another $50 million over 5 years that we put into the school building fund, so that money would be available. So that's $300 million in theory. And then you come to the rest of it and you start to scratch your head, because the $80 million that she counts that is currently being paid, in some cases reimburses communities for building projects they've already undertaken, so you can't spend that money twice. And then to suggest, well, somehow communities, the 36 school districts, 39 cities and towns, the people will approve local bond issues for $300 million, really belies the reality of what these property taxpayers are facing. There are all kinds of fights going on between the appropriating people, the taxing authority in communities, and the schools trying to get what they feel they need for the kids, the taxing authorities getting pressure from seniors and others about constantly increasing property tax rates. So to count $300 million that will be approved locally before it's locally approved, maybe putting the cart before the horse. But you're right, we need to fix up our schools. The $250 million bond issue, I'm not even sure the legislature will keep it at $250 million, is a legitimate, investment. But what it misses, I think, is can we just put money into the old system for fixing up schools? If we're gonna have a school building authority, should the school building authority, talk about a statewide facilities plan and mandate certain things on communities? And question, you mentioned and you gave examples of schools in the inner cities, classical and I
Literally dozens of them across Pawtucket, Central
Right.
Falls,
And
Providence,
you
the
look at those,
urban corridor.
you look at some of those buildings and you wouldn't want
Nope.
kids to be in some of those buildings. So, what happens if the wealthier communities are aggressive in looking for these dollars? How is any of this needs tested? Where is the greatest need and the least capacity to meet that need? And so I don't know how the governor's gonna, figure that in, but just to put a big number out and then not talk about fairness of distribution, need and distribution, equity of distribution, is an interesting question.
I don't remember I don't remember a bond issue over $200 million. I don't even remember, I think around 150 or something
I don't
like
know
that is the
either.
highest bond issue that I remember. I remember we did an environmental one around 120, maybe one of the education ones were around there. This is a big number to take to the voters in an election year of dissent and wrong track and all that sort of stuff. So do you end up with zero?
Well,
'Cause you would.
Well,
You go up or down.
I'll give you some information at the Hassel Institute. We're in the process of putting a poll together in the
Yeah.
next month to try to poll some of those questions on schools and school finance. But I think it's a bold move. I think it's generally a good move. I think it's unfortunate that we're having this conversation about not being clear in how much you're really gonna raise and what you can buy with it. But we've had study after study after study, which demonstrates the need that we need to invest more in our school buildings and school facilities. And every student should be in a school that's environmentally sound. Every student should be in a school that has the right kind of
Technology, I mean,
Yeah,
we're
yeah.
falling behind drastically.
But-
We've got buildings that are 50, 60, 70, 80 years old.
But I see where I have confidence, the fact that we need the money and we need to make the improvements. Where I think the jury is still out is where the devil is. If you get that bond issue, how are you gonna pick winners and losers? How is need gonna be measured?
Well, let's go to the bond issue for a second. First of all, big ask. One time, can't go back for another 2 years. And you're talking about $3 billion in need, and $250 million might get you 2 high schools and 2 middle schools in the state of Rhode Island.
Well, but the point is, when you look at it realistically, you just mentioned that 250 was the biggest bond issue in your memory. We just have a certain amount of financial capacity.
Yeah.
So I think that's not an unrealistic proposal, but I think how the money is spent becomes very important. Should we be make every school environmentally sound first? Should we making sure that the rain doesn't come into the roof of every school? What are the priorities? If we're gonna spend $250 million and we wake up 5 years later and it's spent all over the place,
Right.
it's not clear what we bought for that money. So I'm not concerned about the 250. I'm not concerned. I think the governor's on track and looking at finding.
Do we make the mistake regularly? It seems to be in Rhode Island. I know it's been historically a huge problem at the colleges and universities, in which we build things, but then we have no budget for maintaining them and keeping them at top tier, top performance.
Oh.
There isn't the most basic levels of maintenance budgeted for sustaining. We invest in a $50 million engineering or $100 million engineering center, but then there's no ongoing budget support to keep that
Yeah, it's been
that facility
that's
pristine.
an obvious problem, and it's a very obvious problem with schools because the expense is a shared expense between the state and the cities and towns, and a lot of cities and towns just don't have the fiscal capacity
Right.
to come up with money for maintenance. And likes to admit this dirty little secret, but as you have to negotiate with the teacher unions, you have very little money left to maintain your school buildings.
Let's jump over one thing that clearly the dialogue changed about the PawSox. The speaker said it, others said it, which was, listen, if we're going to do $1 billion for schools, however you want to compute it. That's needed, and the POSOX took a little bit of a hit on that. It was interesting, neither in the governor's State of the State nor in her budget documents was there any mention about the McCoy Stadium rehab and replacement into the Apex site.
Yeah, I find that surprising because it's a major issue. I think the issue gets more attention and more importance than it deserves, frankly, but
Way more.
but it's it's an issue that is in front of people. There's been criticism in the past of the governor giving lip service to it, but not using political capital. Now she's apparently willing to use some political capital on it. Yes, I was surprised.
I don't think she's gonna put political capital into it. She came out of polling in December. I think they got results similar to the Della Volpe poll, not dissimilar from the Fleming poll, and that this is not a popular project, and it's not where people wanna spend their money. And listen, there's a lot of commentary in social media about it. Those that defend it, and I'm gonna say it straight out, are generally male and a much older demographic, are the group that have any interest in building the stadium, other than the unions and the owners.
Well, but I will say this to you, and I don't have a strong feeling, so I have no position on the stadium one way or the other. But you don't do government but whole.
Yeah.
You know, if the leadership, believes that it's an appropriate thing to do, that's the first question you have to get around, and apparently they do. Then the second question is it a good deal? They, Senate obviously believes that they tweaked it, they think it's a good deal.
They might have made that deal worse for the taxpayer.
That's a possibility.
It's about 15% more expensive for Rhode Islanders.
But
16.
Your point of why it wasn't discussed relative to other priorities is, it's a good question. I don't have an answer for that question, but it just seems.
Isn't it now quick? It's almost political quicksand for everybody.
Well, see, you've been around this, I have not looked at this thing, but now that you got the governor pushing for it, the Senate feels very strong about it, Labor's trying to use their muscle, to the point of going into the speaker's districts.
I gotta tell you, it was POSOX driven. That's generally a death sentence. I mean, if you wanna make a speaker mad, go and leaflet, drop mail, and hold meetings in his or her, we've only had his on the speaker side. Generally, legislative leaders don't appreciate it. By the way, rank and file members of legislators and city council members don't like when people try and pull that. That's the fastest way to kill a project in the city of Providence, is go and jump into a city council ward without getting the approval of the council member.
Now I understand the mayor in that community is against the POSOX Stadium. I hope I'm not speaking in error, but if they're gonna have a meeting down there, you have every opportunity, if you're anti it, you pack that meeting.
Oh, absolutely.
And
Steve Frias was out this weekend. Steve Frias, who lost to Nick Mattiello by less than 100 votes, was out going door to door this weekend. I'm told that he got very strong support going door to door in Western Cranston. That's a fiscally conservative area, and I think Mattiello has heard that from his voters as well.
Well,
You don't have, when you win by whatever it was, 88 votes, you don't have a lot of margin for error.
Whether you agree or disagree with the speaker and whether you like or dislike the speaker, you have a much better way of getting what you want by using honey, not vinegar.
Yeah. I've not seen too many speakers who appreciate being publicly embarrassed and politically embarrassed. Generally not a winning scenario.
And I thought it was interesting the way the memo came out on whether or not you could hold a referendum on that issue.
Yeah, right.
Because there's nothing in the world that I know of that would stop a legislature from putting a non-binding referendum on a ballot.
Right.
And
Now, certainly you couldn't trigger the financial obligation
no one ever
via the deal.
No one ever suggested you could. It was just to get the feeling of the public as to whether they wanted you to trigger that obligation or not.
Any other aspects of the budget that you saw was especially interesting? I do want to go to sports betting, and listen. We've read a lot about it over here at GoLocal. We've written on it. We've talked to some folks down in New Jersey who are members of the Christie administration. The first person that wants to put bet on a Supreme Court decision might not necessarily. Supreme Courts have a tendency to do whatever they want to do. And I remember when they outlawed the ban on gay marriages a few years ago, nobody had that as the possible scenario.
No, you're better off betting on sports in the Supreme Court.
Yeah, that's right.
That's for sure.
So that seems, and it seems that it would be. Now, here's an interesting number that Kate Nagel got from the revenue folks. They expect in the first year $831 total $1 million spent in the sports gaming. Now, all the states are going to do it, so you're not going to win any out-of-state people. I mean, all the states are poised to be able to issue this. So, if you're going to take $830 million in new sports gambling, and I guess some of it's in illegal gambling and sports books. I'm not sure that's all going to transfer over, but let's just say $400 million of it is new money. How is that not going to affect the lottery and the gaming at the two Twin River facilities?
It has to.
It absolutely has to, and at a much lower percentage. It's only at like a 4 or 5%.
Is that what I heard?
Yeah, it's tiny.
Yeah, no, there's, if you believe, and sometimes this is proven to be incorrect, but if you believe the public has just so much disposable income to use on gambling, and sports betting is more attractive, they'll, instead of buying a scratch ticket,
Right.
which is not a growth industry, lottery's not a growth, the traditional lottery is not a growth industry, they may go bet on sports gaming. Instead of going and pulling a slot, they may put their $5 on a ball game. At least the slot, they lose their $5 in 30 seconds. On a ball game, take them 3 hours. So it'd be more entertaining. No, it's those things. I don't know the answer to those things. I do believe this. I think there's two ways to look at it. There's a policy question of whether or not we should be using marijuana in sports betting to balance the budget. That's what we've come to.
Well, you're one of those moralist Southerners,
There's nothing wrong with
Bible belt banging. Right. Yeah, of course, right.
There's nothing wrong with having values. But
up here in the Northeast, we're about sin. We're about smoking our marijuana and making some money off of it, and a little more extra gambling.
Well, you remember Merle Haggis song, "We don't smoke marijuana in Muskogee, Oklahoma." But no, I think that the issue with that question, and people can have different opinions, and people can have different. I mean, you can have different opinions on what the facts are, what the best estimates are. But why would you include the money in a budget with all these questions outstanding? Now, maybe the administration has done their homework. They have answers to these questions. I wouldn't suggest they don't. But we put almost $24 million in the budget, and right now it's illegal to collect that money. It may become legal in 9 months. And you could do all the preparatory work ahead of time and not violate, which I think is an important principle of budgeting. Don't budget money that you can't collect, whether it's $1 or $23 million. And then they chose to do this because they feel they can know what the Supreme Court's going to do.
Let's head down to Washington D.C., your other home. Let's see. Last week we had a government shutdown. Not today. So what changed that we no longer have a government shutdown? And who are the winners and losers in this whole thing?
Well, there are no winners yet because the continuing resolution is just till February 8th.
Right.
There's no final decisions. I think the winners, and I think this has some implication for the elections in Rhode Island, I think the winners on this are really the moderates in the Senate.
Yeah.
Whether the Democrat moderates or whether the Republican moderates, they finally, got together and crossed the aisle and worked with each other. So whether it was Senator Flake or Senator Collins or Senator Manchin or Senator Heitkamp, you saw for the first time, and it's going to be hard to put this genie back in the bottle.
Yeah.
But you saw for the first time that there were center-right Republicans and center-left Democrats that ignored the extremes of their party. And it's interesting. Schumer I've always considered to be a kind of he's liberal, but not a progressive liberal. Not true in the House. And he was able to work through that.
Well, it's interesting, when I worked down there in the late 80s and early 2000, that's the way governing went, especially on the Senate side. There were gangs of 7 and gangs of 9, and Rhode Island always had John Chafee as one of the members of those, and John Breaux from Louisiana, and this group of couldn't be more different in many ways. John Bro from Louisiana and John Chafee from Rhode Island, but they're the ones who forged most of the major agreements on most of the major bills that were pending before Congress. But things got done.
And it's too early to say with a certainty that that's gonna happen again.
Yeah.
But at least there's a light that these people came together, and didn't force anything, but got people to at least a temporary yes for the next 3 weeks. And we'll see how it works out. The deal was, we'd open the government up, we'd extend SHIP, Child Insurance Program, for 6 years, and have a debate on immigration, balanced debate on immigration. So I think that's the positive thing. There's some hope there that we can govern. We're not gonna govern from the extreme right, we're not gonna govern from the extreme left. It's gonna have to be some kind of bipartisan group, people that can work across the aisle. And if I can get a commercial, can I get a commercial?
Yeah, please.
I think that's part of Bob Flanders' campaign.
Yeah, yeah. Let's go a little bit back. You were guardedly optimistic on tax reform. Now we're about a month later, 6 weeks later. It's looking pretty good.
I think we're doing okay.
Yeah.
No, and it's not. It's not perfect.
Right.
There are a bunch of compromises in there. There are certainly political considerations. There are fiscal limitations on what you can do. But I think it's a real credit to the private sector. They have stepped up, or
Yeah.
through expansions, and don't believe for a second that they were going to be that generous. Without having some money in their pocket.
You saw Apple repatriate 38 billion, bring just in tax payments, bring back 250 billion from overseas.
And a lot of financial institutions are going to have a little blip because they're going to have high tax bills this year, so profits won't be as strong. But it's working. Walmart increased their starting wage. I won't call it a minimum wage, to $11. What's the minimum wage in Rhode Island now?
10.
I think it's going to go to 11.
Yeah.
So you have all these signs that supply side is working. There are going to be some downturns. We've given up some flexibility, but all the Democrats and all the liberals that were bitching about tax reform, I can't hear them right now.
Well, one journalist in the Rhode Island market was complaining about how it was a tax program for the rich, and the person who was chatting with them said, well, you're going to give back all the wins on your 401k, and they declined to take that offer up.
Oh, even in the corporate stuff, we know 35% goes back to labor, probably 65% of capital, but it's a mixed bag. Your individual circumstances are going to determine whether you do well or not, but every study that's come out, even for the Tax Policy Center, which is a credible group, but a left group associated with Brookings,
Yeah.
said 80% of the people are going to benefit from this. Some of the more conservative people think 90% are going to benefit. So yes, there's going to be a significant benefit.
One last thing. We talked to the Tax Foundation last week. They could not determine yet what the implications are for the states in any state-by-state standpoint. And they certainly were not willing to explicitly make a determination on what the implications are for Rhode Island state budget. There are some states that they see as definitely getting a windfall, but Rhode Island, because of its tax structure and some of the other implications.
Yeah, and that's interesting, because I chaired the commission that recommended the changes in the income tax structure. We were so piggybacked onto the federal that
Right.
if the federal government sneezed, Rhode Island got a code. So we restructured our system not to be as dependent on federal
Right.
decisions. And so it's a pretty independent system. Let's see how some of the corporate changes, wash out, and see what some of the definitions are, maybe some impact there.
Well, Mr. Moneyman, we greatly appreciate it. We are glad you are back. We'll see you next Monday. We're going to hold off your Super Bowl prediction till next Monday.
Okay.
All right.
look forward
After
to
you
it.
look at some film footage and also check out their payroll caps, you look at the cap structure probably
No,
more than
no.
actually the game film.
I look at which team has players from some of my favorite colleges. That's the team we root for.
Moneyman Gary Sasse, thanks so much. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
We're going to take no break today, and we're going to jump over. Don't forget your piping hot tea, and we're going to jump right over to